you beat Brazil! Socceroos! You won't! I am history! I've seen it all! Australia hasn't even kicked a goal in the cup! Brazil has kicked 191! You don't even know
Yeah, Johnny.
what Benito means! Socceroos! Oh my God!
As the World Cup is unfolding currently, I wanted to go back and look at a rivalry that spans past 50 years that almost no one other than people living in the two countries involved knows about. And as the title suggests, and as people watching probably already know, I'm talking about the World Cup rivalry between Australia and Uruguay. In the year of 1930, Uruguay cemented its spot at the top of the football world by defeating Argentina 4-2 in the inaugural World Cup tournament. Although this victory would be the last time Uruguay competed in the World Cup for 20 years, as due to conflicts with European nations refusing to compete in Argentina, Uruguay participated in a boycott for the 1934 World Cup that was being held in Italy. In 1938, they continued this protest against the World Cup due to the FIFA sporting body breaking their promise with the South American teams, with a promise that they made saying that the hosting duties will alternate between Europe and South America, which never ended up happening. The next two World Cups that were scheduled to happen that never did happen because of World War II. Obviously, Uruguay did not participate in the non-existent tournaments, which meant it would be 20 years in 1950 that Uruguay would next compete in a World Cup tournament. The 1950 World Cup, the next one that Uruguay did participate in, was held in Brazil, where Uruguay would once again charge all the way into the final game of the tournament against the hosts themselves. In front of nearly 200,000 fans in Brazil, Uruguay did what many thought was impossible, defeating the heavily favored Brazil team 2-1, which left them 2 of 2 in their World Cup tournaments and with a 100% hit rate, once again bringing the trophy home to Uruguay. To put it plainly, this meant that at the time in 1950, Uruguay dominated the biggest sporting tournament in the world. In 1954, their legendary 30-year streak was broken after falling into 4th place after a defeat to Hungary. Although they failed to qualify in the 1958 tournament and didn't make it out of the group stage in the 1962 tournament, Uruguay once again showed its dominance in football by charging all the way into the final 4 of the tournament, only losing to the eventual winners Brazil that were led by the legendary Pelé team. So with a storied history of World Cup victories by Uruguay, where did this leave Australia during these years? Well, 1930, they did not participate. 1934, they did not participate. 1938, they did not participate. 1942 and 1946, World War II. 1950, they did not participate. 1954, they did not participate. 1960, they did not participate. 1966, they did participate for the very first time. But in this participation, that did not mean that they qualified, losing to North Korea in the 2-game series in a cumulative score of 9-2. Bowing out in pretty pathetic fashion. In 1970, though, they did put up a better fight in the qualifying games in a 2-game series against Israel, but once again, they eventually fell 2-1 cumulatively. So this all brings us to 1974, the very first World Cup that Australia qualified for, held in West Germany. This Australian squad, just like the previous squads, was famously made up of working-class immigrants and part-time amateurs.
For the World Cup have been hampered by the lack of finance and by the players' commitments to clubs and employers. Team captain Peter Wilson is a car salesman. Defender Cole Curran nearest the window, a truck driver. Stylish right-back Doug Uchasenovic works as a storeman. Dutch-born Peter Van Ryn, the team masseur. And from Melbourne, reserve goalkeeper Jim Milisavljevic.
More specifically, 1974 brings us to a pre-tournament 2-game series between Australia and Uruguay. This series was played due to Australia wanting to have experience against elite teams to prepare themselves for the heavyweights in Europe for the upcoming World Cup. This is where Uruguay steps in. Just before Australia departed for West Germany in their historic first ever World Cup appearance, Uruguay travelled to Australia for the 2-game series. The first match played in Melbourne was a great success for the Australian team, drawing with the World Cup constants 0-0. This match was not played without controversy though, as famously it was remembered for its physical play style from the Uruguayans, with Australian manager Rail Rasic referring to the Uruguayans' antics as dirty. In the second game though, played in Sydney, the Uruguayans clearly had no intention of lowering their aggression, with one specific incident outweighing anything that had happened in the first match. With the scores still locked at 0-0 and still early on in the match, Uruguayan player Luis Garisto struck Australian player Ray Bartz in the neck. Despite what happened, Bartz continued to play and play great, scoring the first goal for Australia and assisting on the second goal.
A long ball for Ollerton, and the Uruguayan keeper, straying too far upfield, is stranded. Ollerton rounds him in a flash, and Uruguay's fate is sealed. Australia 2, Uruguay 0.
Following the second goal, Bartz engaged with some trash talk with the Uruguayan players, which led to the previously mentioned Uruguayan player Garisto punching Bartz right in the face. But unlike the first act, this time the referee did not let this action go unpunished. This resulted in a rightfully given instant red card to Garisto, somehow to the dismay of the Uruguayan coaches and players. This leads us to perhaps some of the strangest acts that you will ever see in a sporting game. One of Garisto's own teammates punched him in the face in an attempt to convince the referee that Bartz was actually the one that initiated the violence. With the referee clearly not buying this facade, this led to the Uruguayan staff and coaches and substitutes all rushing the field, causing the referee to threaten to throw the whole game out. Despite this, the match did end up going on with Australia holding on and claiming a great victory. However, the jubilation from the victory was extremely short-lived, as directly after the game, Bartz, who, as I mentioned, at the beginning of the game was struck in the neck by Garisto, was beginning to show signs of a stroke and had to be rushed to a hospital nearby, falling unconscious for 2 days. After being advised by doctors that another significant strike to his neck could kill him, Bartz was forced to retire at the peak of his powers at the age of 27. Ray Bartz not only would be able to never play football again, but he would never be able to participate in the World Cup that he was part of, leading his team to. Despite what happened in the incident, Ray Bartz later confirmed that years later and decades later, no Uruguayan coach, staff, or Garisto himself ever contacted Bartz to apologize for taking away his dream of competing at the 1974 World Cup. Both teams would go on to finish last in their respective groups in the 1974 World Cup, both totaling 0 wins across each other's groups. These teams would not meet again though until 18 years later, with Australia's goodwill tour of South America prior to the 1994 World Cup, a World Cup that neither team even ended up qualifying for. This match, contrary to the prior meeting, was a calm one, with Uruguay comfortably claiming victory. 3 years later, in their next meeting, Australia would get their win back in the 1997 semi-finals of the Confederates Cup. The match remained at a deadlock at 0-0 throughout the first 90 minutes. In extra time, Australian striker Harry Kewell scored the golden goal in the 92nd minute, instantly ending the match and sending the Socceroos to the final. This all leads us to the precursor to the 2002 World Cup, a 2-game series qualification tournament between Uruguay and Australia. Australia coming first place in the Oceania tournament and Uruguay coming 5th place in the South American tournament meant that the 2 teams would face off for the final spot in the 2002 World Cup. This 2-game series was not only the highest stakes that either team had ever faced against each other, it was also the most controversial since their initial meeting in 1974. The 2 games were played in Melbourne and Montevideo, respectively, with Australia hoping to qualify for the first time since 1974 and Uruguay for the first time since 1990. The rather relaxed first game was claimed by Australia in Melbourne in a 1-0 victory. The second game, played in Uruguay, was not so uneventful. With this being a World Cup qualifier, Uruguay intended on using any tactics at their disposal, especially after their initial loss in Melbourne. The moment the Australian team landed in Montevideo, they were immediately met by a lynch mob. This lynch mob proceeded to spit, punch, and hurl death threats at the Australian players as they made their way to the bus.
A small but vocal bunch of passionate Uruguay supporters out to rattle a few Australian nerves, but the mood quickly changed. Competitive spirit became outright abuse. Some of the locals spat on the Socceroos. Coach Frank Farina on the receiving end of this distasteful welcome. So too player Craig Moore, forced to hide his head behind his tracksuit. Those who weren't spat on wore a face full of pepper spray. One of the locals thought that would be a laugh.
What do you think about Uruguay?
Not a single player or official made it out of the airport without being pushed or shoved.
Even the airport customs were involved in the intimidation, intentionally delaying the Australian players making their way to the bus, inspecting tiny specks of dirt on their boots, leaving them in front of the hostile crowd for as long as possible. The Aussies eventually made it past the crowded mob that had blocked off the exit and made it onto their bus. In Uruguay, local news outlets such as El País actually expressed intense embarrassment and shock over the treatment of the Australian players in the airport by Uruguayan fans. Once the Australian team made it to their hotel room, they made the decision that in order to avoid another confrontation with the Uruguayan fans, other than training, they would remain in their hotel rooms for all 3 days prior to the match. The conditions for the Australian players in the hotel rooms, though, were not much better than the conditions in the airport, with fans camping out of the Australians' hotels, beating drums, setting off fireworks, and chanting until 3 a.m., completely disrupting the Australian players' sleep. Even local security and police completely turned a blind eye to this behaviour, watching the spectacle unfold. Australian coach Frank Farina was so disgusted by the lack of civilization and safety for the Australian players that Soccer Australia actually threatened to cancel the training camp in Uruguay and completely move their training to Argentina to avoid the disruptions and the disrespect by the Uruguayan people. All these actions actually led to a formal diplomatic protest by the Australian governing body, which led to heightening police and security around the Australian team during their time in Uruguay. The hotel was placed under a strict 24/7 supervision by armed guards. By the time game day rolled around, it was clear these tactics had worked on the Australian team, with Uruguay thumping them in an 0-3 loss that was devastating to the nation. This resulted in an aggregate 3-1 victory to Uruguay, sending them into the World Cup, with Australia extending its 28-year drought. In Australia, major newspapers and TV outlets lashed out at the lack of security in Uruguay, calling the Uruguayan fans hooligans and calling the whole environment uncivilized. Broadcasts continuously displayed footage of the chaotic and unpoliced exit of the airport by the Australian team. What came next in this saga was one of the most chaotic and important events in Australian sporting history. Once again, the two nations drew each other in the qualifiers for the 2006 World Cup. Looking to break their now 32-year drought from competing in the World Cup, Australia decided to completely change up its tactics and its preparation. Australia hired world-class manager Gus Hiddink and completely overhauled its logistics. In previous World Cup campaigns, Hiddink led his home nation to the finals of the 1998 World Cup in France. And in 2002, he pulled off one of the greatest shocks in sporting history, guiding co-host South Korea all the way into the semi-finals of the tournament, beating powerhouses like Italy and Spain. He became a national hero in Korea, gaining citizenship and having a stadium named after him.
It's a possibility, nothing more than that.
No, you have to be realistic and honest in this, because Australia at that time was number 54 on FIFA ranking. And that says a lot also. When you have to play one of the South American teams, number 5, and they all, whether it's Paraguay, whether it's Ecuador, and in this case Uruguay, they are all almost in top 20.
On arrival, Hiddink was shocked by the low fitness level of the Australian players, who were actually in preparation for their European football seasons.
No, when all the players are fit, and I know several, when all the players are fit, I think this team is very competitive. The only thing they have to deal with those circumstances, which we talked about, and I think when they can improve a little bit in their not in the mental way, but in their tactical way, we might have a chance to make the impossible possible.
Who's sitting? Thank you.
Thank you.
He immediately organised an intense and grueling training session for the Australian players taking place in the Netherlands. He pushed the squad to their absolute limits, turning an already naturally athletic team into an elite squad that was based on their now 120-minute level, no intensity dropping conditioning. When it came to the mind games and the tactics going into Uruguay, Hiddink also completely overhauled the program. Australia refused to stay in Uruguay. They held their training camp in Buenos Aires, Argentina, only flying into Montevideo for the first qualifying match 24 hours before the game. When the plane landed in Uruguay, security officials completely bypassed the initial terminal, where all the angry fans would wait in the past meetings. They actually utilized decoy buses in the tarmac, ensuring that not one Australian player would hear a single heckler on the way to the hotel. He ordered the entire Australian squad to wear heavy, noise-cancelling headphones and earphones to completely block out the screaming South American fans in public spaces and at the stadium. Along with this, he strictly forbade any Australian player to react to any physical or verbal altercation on the pitch at the hands of the Uruguayan players. He drilled into them that any altercation like this that would result in a red card would completely ruin their World Cup campaign. These changes, though, did not go unnoticed by the Uruguayan Football Association. Noticing that they weren't able to use their previously used tactics, they engaged in a new one, abruptly shifting the game in Montevideo back several hours. This was a calculated move by the Uruguayans, in an attempt to ensure that the Australians would miss their planned commercial flight back to Sydney for the second match, delaying their recovery. At the end of the match, Uruguay walked away with a 1-0 victory over Australia. Hiddink was absolutely furious in his post-match press conference. He blamed the game's only goal on a blatant referee blunder, pointing out that the flagman had ruled a foul in Australia's favour, but the head referee overruled it. It led directly to Uruguay scoring the free kick, putting them up 1-0 and directly winning them the match. Despite the complaining and the controversy from Hiddink, he completely maintained that a 0-1 deficit was still a completely salvageable series at the hands of Australia when going back to Sydney. In the Uruguayan media, though, there was a completely palpable feeling that the job was basically done. Uruguayan player Roboca would make the comment that would ignite a international firestorm between the two countries. He was quoted saying, "Uruguay has a divine right to be at the World Cup because of our history. With all respect to Australia, we are a football nation. They are not." This type of rhetoric was commonplace in the Uruguayan camps and amongst their fans, with the belief that Uruguay had a national privilege to play at the World Cup due to their history, rather than a mediocre football nation in Australia. The second leg of the series, like I said, taking place in Sydney, was where Australia took use of the exact same tactics that Uruguay used back in 2001. The moment leg one in Montevideo ended, the Australian team boarded their plane back to Sydney. But this was not a regular plane. This was a state-of-the-art Qantas Boeing 767 jet that was parked directly on the tarmac in Montevideo, especially for the Australian soccer team. A jet that was provided by billionaire Football Federation chairman Frank Lowry. A jet that Frank directly secretly chartered. It was, on top of already being a world-class jet, was a heavily modified world-class jet, with facilities including massage tables, nutritional meals provided, compression gear, and a sleep schedule that was directly tracked onto Sydney time. Funnily enough, Uruguay being the ones that initially shifted and messed with the game time in Montevideo, they actually messed up their own connection. They missed their flight, got stranded in transit in New Zealand, and were forced to fly to Australia in regular economy class. Even though Uruguay were the ones that held the 1-0 lead in the series, they were actually the squad that began to show mental cracks in the travel window. In a desperate attempt to secure a better flight accommodation for their trip back to Sydney, the Uruguayan officials actually began to frantically fax the Australian officials begging for a spot on Australia's flight in their Boeing jet. Expectedly, the Australians flat out refused. By the time the Uruguayans landed in Sydney, bruised and exhausted, the Australians were already fully slept, rested, and already training. The Australian media directly fed into the fury of the Australian fans for the treatment of the Socceroos back in 2001, telling the fans to give it back to the Uruguayans upon their arrival in Sydney. TV networks repeatedly played clips of Australian coach Frank Farana being spat on in the airport and players being shoved around upon their arrival in Montevideo back in 2001. While celebrating Australia's luxury in their private jet, in their arrival, in their coordinated travel and training times, the Australian media also routinely knocked the Uruguayan Federation's blunder in attempting to sabotage the Australians in the change of schedule of the first match. Journalists gleefully reported that the Uruguayan superstars were forced to fly cattle class or economy, landing in Sydney exhausted and jet lagged. The media fully portrayed the Uruguayan team as a team fully unraveled and exhausted before kickoff time had even arrived. John O'Neill, Football Federation Australia's CEO, publicly stoked the flames of the Uruguayan and Australian rivalry, stating, We remember exactly how our boys were treated back in Montevideo in 2001. We were spat on and abused. We aren't going to break the law, but we are going to make Sydney an absolute living hell for them on the pitch. When the Uruguayan players eventually made it to their hotel rooms, still exhausted and bruised up from the first match, they were met with the same treatment by the Australian fans as the Socceroos were met by the Uruguayan fans back in 2001, with Australian fans disrupting their sleep chanting right outside the hotel rooms, right until kickoff. Jorge Fossati, the Uruguayan coach, was visibly rattled by not only their treatment at the hotels, but by the treatment by the Australian media, lashed out in his pre-match press conference, saying, "The behaviour of the Australian fans and the press has been deeply unprofessional. They are trying to win the game in the hotels and in the newspapers because they know they cannot beat us cleanly on the grass. We are veterans of world football. A few fireworks will not scare us." On the 16th of November, it was game day. To put it plainly, the Australian fans did not disappoint in what was called a so-called non-football nation. Fired up by days of media reminding them of the 2001 airport attacks on their own players, as soon as the Uruguayan anthem begun, it was met by a chorus of boos and hurls by the Australian fans in attendance. The noise of the boos was so immense, in fact, that it actually blew out the stadium's PA system and visibly shell-shocked the Uruguayan players. The stadium was a strict, blinding sea of gold and green, with any sight of any positive play by the Socceroos erupting the whole stadium in a cheer from the Australian fans. On the other hand, anytime any Uruguayan player touched the football, they were met with a chorus of boos, heckles, and jarring remarks by the Australian fans. But at the end of the day, this was a football game, not a competition for whose fans could make the most noise. So how did the Socceroos actually perform in the second leg of the qualifying games? Well, Australia seemingly at the very least had the full intention of matching the Uruguayans' physicality. Within 25 minutes of the match beginning, Australian player Tony Popovich caught Uruguayan star player Alvaro Recoba with a straight elbow, drawing blood.
That was an arm across the face by Tony Popovich, and Popovich is going to get a yellow card for that.
Knowing the referee in this match was under intense pressure, Hiddink made an unusual and a ruthless call on the pitch, substituting off Popovich in the 31st minute to avoid a potential red card and subbing on Harry Kewell. Just 4 minutes after Kewell entered the pitch, he made an instant impact. Kewell picked up the ball on the edge of the in-play area, tearing through the Uruguayan defence.
Tactical switch.
His first touch in the field. Finding Cahill. Can't tight the spaces. Here's Harry Kewell. Missed it, and it's in!
Still there!
Australia have scored! Marco Bresciano! 33 minutes played, and Telstra Stadium erupts. Australia are level. What a moment!
The stadium erupted with Australia taking a 1-0 lead in the match and an aggregated 1-1 tie in the accumulated series. After a grueling 90 minutes of play, the game was finished with a 1-0 score led by, as I said, Australia. This meant to decide who was going to the World Cup, a 30 minutes of extra time would be played. Both teams were completely running on empty. Uruguay sat deep, playing entirely for penalties and with physical defense in order to slow the game down. The referee blew the whistle at 120 minutes. This final ticket to the World Cup between these bitter rivals would be decided with a penalty shootout. This also meant that the two teams would be moved in front of the loudest section of the Australian crowd.
Here we go. It's Harry Kewell against Fabian Carini. First penalty, Australia. Goal. Beautifully put away by Harry Kewell. Rodriguez against Mark Schwarzer. Save by Schwarzer! He's done it again! It's Lucas Neal, who's had a great game. It's Neal. It's 2-0. It's Varela. It's just underneath Schwarzer. It's Wittler. Beautiful. It's beautifully put away. On your son. Beautifully tucked away. Paducah. Oh, he's put it wide. Here is Salajeta. Oh, great save again by Schwarzer.
Huge save.
Wonderful save.
4-2. It wins it for us, John.
Here's Aloisi for a place in the World Cup.
For us.
He scored! Australia have done it!
Come on!
John Aloisi, the Confederations Cup hero!
Come on, Australia! Johnny Warren!
At last! At long last!
Australia wins the shootout 4-2, not only vanquishing their bitter rivals in Uruguay, but punching their ticket into the 2006 World Cup.
When we started preparing in August in Holland, I found a group who was very eager to get, after 32 years, very close to Holland in Germany on this World Cup. And I think once more, and then we stop talking, celebrate people, once more a huge applause for these guys.
Inside the Socceroos dressing room, the atmosphere was absolute bedlam.
So it was fitting one of Hollywood's biggest stars, John Travolta, was part of the dressing room's song and dance.
The Uruguayan team, keeping their classy demeanor from the previous history that we've spoken about, did not take this loss with grace. Star midfielder for Uruguay, Alvaro Recoba, who previously, like I mentioned, stoked the flames for the match, claiming that Uruguay had a divine right to compete in the tournament, refused to give Australia any credit for the victory, saying, "They are not a better football team than us, they won on penalties, which is a lottery." Australia went on to put on a thrilling and historic performance at the 2006 World Cup. Australia was drawn into a daunting group featuring powerhouse country Japan, European dark horse nation Croatia, and the incumbent champions in Brazil. Trailing 1-0 with just 6 minutes left in regulation, Australia pulled off one of the greatest comebacks in World Cup history against Japan. Subbed on by hitting, Australian football legend Tim Cahill scored a double for Australia, which were the first ever goals by Australia at the World Cup. This was followed by a late game strike by John Aloisi, which would secure Australia's victory and their first ever victory in the World Cup. After a loss to Brazil and a draw with Croatia, Australia officially finished second place in the daunting group, advancing into the round of 16. Only problem was that Australia, in the round of 16, drew world powerhouse Italy, which many saw as, the way that Australia would emphatically be exited from their fairy tale World Cup campaign. The Socceroos put on a defensive masterclass against Italy, mainly mastered by elite defensive player Lucas Neal. When an Italian defender was actually red carded in the 50th minute, Australia took complete control of the match, pushing the match all the way into the 95th minute at a 0-0 scoreline. In the literal final seconds of the 95th minute, right before extra time would have started, Italian fullback drove directly into the box, tripping over sliding defender Lucas Neal. Despite replays showing that Italian player Grosso directly initiated the contact and heavily fabricated the impact, the referee pointed directly at the penalty spot for Italy. Italy smashed the penalty home which would seal Australia's defeat, sending them home in an 0-1 loss. While the exit was gut-wrenching, Italy did go on to win the 2006 World Cup, proving just how close Hiddink Socceroos' squad was to claiming football immortality in 2006. Under Gus Hiddink, the Socceroos not only captured the heart of Australian soccer fans, but also football fans around the whole world, fully portraying and putting on display the heart of the Australian spirit.
9 out of 10 World Cup Socceroos kick off their day with the long-lasting energy and goodness of 97% whole grain Weet-Bix.